Tell me something, sweetheart. If you're so good with numbers, why are you carrying steak plates instead of running a hedge fund? The table exploded with laughter. Crystal glasses clinked beneath the amber lights of Whitmore Prime Steakhouse, while downtown Chicago shimmered behind the floor-to-ceiling windows like a kingdom built on money. Daniel Whitmore leaned back in his leather chair, one arm draped casually across the booth, silver at his temples catching the warm light. 52 years old, worth nearly $4 billion, and completely accustomed to being the smartest man in every room he entered. Across from him, three investors laughed a little too hard at the joke, eager to stay close to power. Claire Bennett stood beside the table holding a tray with 2 bourbons and a medium-rare ribeye. She didn't laugh. She simply placed the drinks down carefully, one by one, her movements calm, measured, almost detached from the noise around her. "I asked you a question," Daniel continued, swirling the ice in his whiskey. "You heard me, didn't you?" Claire finally looked at him. Her tired blue eyes reflected the city lights behind him, steady and unreadable. "I heard you," she said softly. "Then answer it." Another grin spread across Daniel's face. "Come on, entertain us. The market opens in less than 12 hours. Where would you put $10 million tomorrow morning?" One of the younger bankers smirked immediately, probably under the mattress. More laughter, but Claire didn't react. Not angry, not embarrassed, just quiet. The kind of quiet that slowly makes people uncomfortable. Outside, rain streaked against the windows in silver lines while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the skyline. Claire glanced once toward the muted Bloomberg screen mounted above the bar. Red numbers crawled across the bottom ticker. Futures slipping. Asian markets unstable. Her fingers tightened slightly around the tray. Then she spoke. "Not tomorrow morning." The laughter faded. Daniel's brow twitched. "Excuse me." Claire set the tray against her hip. "If your firm still has heavy exposure in commercial office debt," she said calmly, "you should start selling. Tonight. Before Tokyo opens." Silence. Real silence this time. One investor slowly lowered his wine glass. Another turned toward the Bloomberg screen instinctively. Daniel's smile disappeared inch by inch. Claire continued before anyone could interrupt her. "Especially Chicago and San Francisco properties. Vacancy rates are hiding bigger liquidity problems than your analysts are admitting publicly." A pulse moved sharply in Daniel's jaw. "And how exactly would a waitress know what my analysts are saying?" Claire met his stare evenly. "Because they're wrong." Nobody moved. Even the piano music near the bar suddenly felt distant now, swallowed by the weight pressing down on the table. Daniel stared at the woman standing beside him in a cream-colored waitress uniform and sensible black shoes. And for the first time that evening, he stopped seeing a waitress at all. Nobody at the table touched their drink after that. The rain outside grew heavier, sliding down the glass windows in slow silver rivers while the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and blue behind them. Daniel Whitmore kept staring at Claire Bennett as though the room had quietly shifted beneath his feet. "You are making a very confident statement," he finally said, his voice lower now, stripped of the easy arrogance from earlier. Claire adjusted the sleeve of her cream uniform calmly. "No," she replied. "I am making a cautious one." One of the investors let out a nervous laugh. "Commercial real estate has been stabilizing for months." Claire turned slightly toward him. "Publicly, yes." Her tone stayed soft, almost gentle. "But refinancing deadlines are starting to hit properties that were overvalued during the zero-interest years. Banks are pretending the damage is temporary because panic spreads faster than debt." The man opened his mouth, then stopped. Daniel leaned forward slowly, elbows resting against the polished walnut table. "And what exactly do you think happens when Tokyo opens?" Claire glanced once more toward the financial ticker above the bar. Red numbers continued flashing silently across the screen. "Fear," she answered. "And fear is contagious." The pianist near the lounge shifted into a slower melody while waiters moved carefully between tables carrying trays of wine and filet mignon beneath the warm amber lighting. Yet somehow the entire restaurant suddenly felt colder around Daniel Whitmore. He had spent 30 years building instincts sharper than most people's intelligence. And right now, every instinct he had was screaming the same thing. This woman knew something. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. "Claire." "Claire what?" "Claire Bennett." Daniel repeated the name once under his breath as though filing it somewhere private in his memory. Then he leaned back again, studying her more carefully this time. The loose strands of blonde hair near her temple, the exhaustion hidden beneath her eyes, the composure, not the rehearsed politeness of hospitality workers who depended on tips, but the restraint of someone accustomed to much higher rooms than this one. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked. Claire gave the faintest shrug. "Reading." One investor scoffed immediately. "Nobody talks about liquidity exposure like that from reading newspapers." Claire looked at him evenly. "That is because newspapers usually arrive after the damage is already done." Silence again. Daniel slowly lifted his whiskey glass, but did not drink from it. His fingers had stopped moving completely now. Across the table, one of his senior partners quietly pulled out his phone beneath the tablecloth, checking overseas futures markets. Claire noticed. So did Daniel. "Interesting timing," Daniel murmured. Claire picked up the empty appetizer plates carefully. Timing is usually the difference between rich people and ruined people. Daniel almost smiled at that. Almost. But before he could say another word, Claire stepped back from the table. "Enjoy your dinner, gentlemen." Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen beneath the warm restaurant lights. Calm, steady, leaving behind a table full of millionaires who suddenly no longer felt comfortable inside their expensive suits. Daniel Whitmore barely tasted the 48-ounce dry-aged ribeye sitting in front of him. The steak cooled slowly beneath the restaurant lights while conversations returned around the dining room in careful fragments. But his attention never fully left the hallway leading toward the kitchen. "You are unusually quiet tonight," one of his partners finally said. Daniel loosened the cuff of his charcoal suit slightly, without looking up. Do not confuse quiet with distracted. But he was distracted. Completely. 20 minutes earlier, Claire Bennett had dismantled half the assumptions his firm had been operating on for months, while carrying bourbon glasses on a serving tray. That did not happen by accident. Daniel built an empire because he trusted patterns. And Claire Bennett did not fit any pattern he knew. Across the table, Richard Lawson refreshed overseas market futures on his phone again, his forehead tightening immediately afterward. Daniel noticed. "What?" he asked sharply. Richard hesitated. Tokyo Banking Index just slipped another 2%. Nobody spoke after that. The soft jazz music near the bar suddenly felt irritating now, too polished, too calm compared to the pressure building quietly around the table. Daniel reached for his whiskey at last and took a slow sip. Even the bourbon tasted different tonight. Less smooth, more bitter. Meanwhile, behind the heavy steel kitchen doors, Claire moved through the narrow corridor carrying empty plates toward the dish station. Heat rolled from the grills in waves while cooks shouted orders over the hiss of butter and fire. Yet somehow she remained composed inside the chaos. Calm hands, calm breathing. Only the slight tension near her jaw betrayed anything underneath. "Claire," another waitress whispered beside her while polishing silverware. "What did you say to those finance guys out there?" Claire slid a plate onto the rack carefully. "Nothing important. The old guy in the gray suit has been staring at this kitchen for 10 straight minutes." Claire almost smiled at that. Almost. But exhaustion settled too heavily behind her eyes tonight. She tied her apron tighter around her waist and reached for another tray. Her shift still had 3 hours left. Rent was due Friday. Her father's medication refill was already overdue by 2 days. And somewhere, upstairs in the city above them, billionaires were suddenly nervous because a waitress had spoken one honest sentence. The irony was almost funny. Near midnight, the rain finally eased outside. Chicago glistened beneath the wet reflections of streetlights and passing taxis, while fog drifted lightly between the skyscrapers. Daniel stood alone beside the restaurant windows now, one hand in his pocket, staring down at the city below. His dinner guests had already left. Important men with expensive coats and carefully controlled anxiety. But Daniel remained. Waiting. Watching. Then he saw her. Claire emerged from the kitchen carrying a fresh pot of coffee toward another table near the back lounge. Warm light brushed softly against her face as she leaned forward to refill a customer's cup with quiet patience. No performance. No need for attention. Just competence. Precision. Control. Daniel narrowed his eyes slightly. Because for the first time in many years, something truly unfamiliar had entered his world. Uncertainty. And Daniel Whitmore hated uncertainty more than failure itself. At 2:17 that morning, Daniel Whitmore was still awake inside his penthouse office overlooking Lake Michigan. The city below shimmered beneath wet streets and drifting fog, while muted television screens flashed financial headlines across the dark room. Tokyo markets had officially opened 12 minutes earlier, and Claire Bennett had been right. Daniel stood motionless near the glass windows, one hand resting against the edge of his desk, while red numbers rolled downward across every monitor in front of him. Commercial property funds were slipping fast. Banking stocks followed seconds later, fear spreading exactly the way she predicted. Quietly at first, then all at once. Unbelievable, Richard Lawson muttered from across the office. His tie hung loose now, exhaustion replacing confidence. Nobody saw this coming. Daniel did not answer, because somebody had seen it coming. A waitress carrying bourbon glasses in a downtown steakhouse had seen it before half of Wall Street. His jaw tightened slowly. "Pull our exposure reports," he ordered calmly. "All of them." Richard hesitated. "Tonight." Daniel finally turned toward him. Steel gray eyes, sharp enough to cut through excuses. "Does this feel like tomorrow to you?" Richard immediately reached for his phone. Silence filled the office again except for distant thunder outside and the low hum of television screens glowing blue against the dark marble walls. Daniel loosened his cufflinks slowly as he stared at Claire Bennett's name written across a legal pad beside him. 2 words. That was all. Yet somehow those 2 words had unsettled him more than billion-dollar negotiations ever had. Meanwhile, 30 blocks south, Claire climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment, carrying a paper grocery bag against her chest. Dawn had not arrived yet. The hallway lights flickered softly above her, while cold wind slipped through cracks near the old windows. She unlocked apartment 4B quietly and stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of coffee and medicine. Small, worn, clean. A single lamp glowed near the couch where her father slept beneath a gray blanket. Television still playing softly in the background. Claire stood still for a moment watching him breathe. The tension inside her shoulders finally softened slightly. Then she set the grocery bag onto the kitchen counter and opened her old laptop beside the sink. Futures markets continued falling. Fast now. Faster than even she expected. Claire closed her eyes briefly. "Of course," she whispered under her breath. Not satisfaction. Not pride. Just exhaustion. She already knew what came next. Panic. Blame. Emergency meetings filled with men pretending they had always seen the danger coming. That was how finance worked. Nobody listened before the fall. Only after. Her phone suddenly buzzed against the counter. Unknown number. Claire stared at the screen without touching it while rain tapped softly against the apartment window behind her. The phone buzzed again, then stopped. A voicemail notification appeared seconds later. Claire hesitated before pressing play. Daniel Whitmore's voice filled the quiet kitchen immediately. Calm, controlled, but different now somehow. Less amused. "Claire, this is Daniel Whitmore. I think we need to continue our conversation." Claire stared silently at the dark window above the sink where her reflection looked tired beneath the weak apartment light. Then she deleted the voicemail without listening twice. By 7:30 that morning, every financial network in America was using the same words. Market instability, liquidity concerns, unexpected exposure. Daniel Whitmore stood inside the executive conference room on the 63rd floor of Whitmore Capital while Chicago disappeared beneath thick gray clouds outside the glass walls. 12 executives sat around the polished black table pretending not to panic. Coffee cups trembled slightly against saucers. Laptop screens glowed with collapsing charts and emergency forecasts. "How bad is it?" Daniel asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. That was answer enough. Finally, the chief risk officer cleared his throat. "If regional defaults continue through the quarter, we could lose between 800 million and 1.2 billion. Silence spread heavily across the room. Daniel slowly removed his reading glasses and set them onto the table with deliberate calm. "Yesterday," he said carefully, "every single person in this room told me our exposure was manageable." Nobody moved. Nobody blinked. "Daniel," one executive began nervously, "the data models did not indicate." "Your models," Daniel interrupted softly, "did not survive one waitress carrying a tray of bourbon." The room froze. Even the rain against the windows seemed quieter somehow. Daniel stood and walked toward the massive screen displaying red market indicators across Asia and Europe. "A woman working double shifts in a steakhouse understood this collapse before my entire risk division." His voice never rose. That somehow made it worse. "So either she is a genius," he continued slowly, "or I am surrounded by frauds." Across the table, nervous glances passed between executives like silent warnings. Daniel noticed every one of them. For the first time in years, tiny cracks were appearing inside the machine he built. Tiny hesitations, tiny fears, tiny lies. And once Daniel Whitmore noticed weakness, he never stopped looking for it. Meanwhile, Claire Bennett sat quietly inside a crowded city bus heading toward downtown. Morning sunlight pushed weakly through rain clouds while tired commuters stared down at phones filled with financial headlines. Nobody noticed the blonde waitress near the back window sipping cheap black coffee from a paper cup. Nobody knew the woman in the worn gray coat had predicted half the crisis currently shaking Wall Street. Claire leaned her forehead lightly against the cold window glass. She had seen this before. Different year. Different men in expensive suits. Same arrogance. Same denial. Her phone buzzed again inside her coat pocket. Unknown number. Again. Claire exhaled slowly before answering this time. "What?" she said softly. Daniel Whitmore's voice came through immediately. Calm. Direct. "You deleted my voicemail." Claire stared out at the wet Chicago streets sliding past outside. "You sound surprised." A pause followed. "Meet me tonight," Daniel said. No, another pause. Longer this time. "You already know something bigger is happening," he said quietly. "I can hear it in your voice." Claire closed her eyes briefly. Because that part was true. The market collapse was not the real problem. It was only the symptom. "Mr. Whitmore," she replied carefully, "the dangerous part is never the debt people can see." Daniel's voice lowered slightly. "Then tell me what I cannot see." Claire watched morning light flicker across rain-soaked buildings outside the bus window, while silence stretched painfully between them. Then she whispered 4 words that made Daniel Whitmore stop breathing for a moment. "Look inside your own company." Daniel Whitmore did not speak for several seconds after the call ended. The skyline outside his office windows looked colorless now beneath the storm clouds gathering over Chicago, and somewhere far below, sirens echoed faintly through wet streets. "Look inside your own company." 4 words. Quiet words. Yet they landed harder than any boardroom accusation ever had. Daniel slowly lowered the phone from his ear while the executive conference room behind him continued buzzing with controlled panic. Analysts speaking too quickly. Lawyers whispering near the doorway. Television anchors predicting uncertainty with polished smiles. But Daniel heard none of it anymore. His mind kept returning to Claire Bennett's voice. Calm. Certain. Unafraid. "Sir." Richard Lawson approached carefully beside him. "We may need to halt several positions before the opening bell." Daniel remained staring at the city below. "Who approved the Harbor Point refinancing package?" Richard blinked. "What?" Daniel turned slowly now. Sharp gray eyes colder than the rain outside. "The commercial debt package tied to Harbor Point." Richard adjusted his tie instinctively. Tiny movement. Barely noticeable. But Daniel noticed everything. "That was handled internally months ago," Richard answered carefully. "Why?" Daniel said nothing for a moment. Silence stretching long enough to become uncomfortable. Then he walked back toward the conference table and pressed a button on the remote beside him. Financial projections vanished from the massive screen. A new document appeared instead. Harbor Point Holdings. Internal approvals. Signatures. Transfer authorizations. Daniel studied the names quietly while tension thickened inside the room. "Interesting," he murmured. "Very interesting." Across the table, the chief compliance officer shifted uneasily in his chair. "Daniel, this is not the priority right now." Daniel looked up immediately. "No." His voice stayed calm. "Because from where I am standing, it suddenly feels like the only priority." Nobody spoke after that. Rain hammered harder against the windows now, darkening the room with flashes of gray light. Daniel stepped closer to the screen. Someone inside this company knowingly buried unstable debt through offshore restructuring. He tapped the document once. And whoever did it assumed I would never look closely enough to notice. A heavy silence followed. The kind that exposes guilt faster than shouting ever could. Meanwhile, across the city, Claire Bennett tied her apron quietly inside the employee locker room at Whitmore Prime Steakhouse. Warm overhead lights flickered softly while distant dinner conversations drifted through the walls outside. Another shift beginning. Another night pretending. She belonged nowhere near the world she understood too well. "Claire." The restaurant manager called nervously from the hallway. "There is someone here asking for you." Claire froze slightly. She already knew who it was. When she stepped onto the restaurant floor, Daniel Whitmore stood near the empty piano lounge alone in a dark wool coat, silver reins still clinging lightly to his shoulders. No bodyguards tonight. No investors. No performance. Just a tired billionaire staring at a woman who had quietly shaken his entire world in less than 24 hours. Claire stopped several feet away. "You should not be here," she said softly. Daniel gave a humorless smile. "Neither should you." Warm jazz music drifted faintly through the restaurant, while candlelight flickered across polished glasses nearby. Claire folded her arms carefully. "Did you find what you were looking for inside your company?" Daniel's expression darkened slightly. "I found enough to know you were telling the truth." Claire looked away for a moment. Not proud, not satisfied, just sad somehow. Daniel noticed that too. "Who are you really?" he asked quietly. Claire met his eyes again beneath the soft golden light. Then she answered with a sentence that made the room suddenly feel much smaller around them. "Someone your industry buried a long time ago." Claire Bennett held Daniel Whitmore's gaze for several long seconds after speaking those words. The restaurant around them continued moving softly in the background, glasses clinking, low jazz drifting through warm golden light, wealthy customers laughing over expensive wine, completely unaware that something much heavier had settled between the billionaire and the waitress near the piano lounge. Daniel studied her carefully now, not like a customer, not even like a businessman evaluating risk, more like a man trying to understand how an entire story could exist beneath a quiet face he almost ignored 48 hours ago. "What happened to you?" he asked finally. Claire let out a slow breath through her nose. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." She almost smiled at that. Not warmly, more like someone hearing a sentence they stopped believing. "Years ago." Claire looked down briefly at the white coffee cup warming her hands. 10 years ago, she said softly, "I worked for a private investment firm in New York." Daniel remained silent. "I was good at it." Her voice stayed calm, but something older moved underneath it now. Fatigue. Old disappointment. Too good, apparently. Rain rolled quietly against the restaurant windows while lightning flickered faintly beyond the skyline outside. Claire continued staring into the coffee instead of at him. "I found fraudulent debt restructuring hidden through offshore subsidiaries." Daniel's jaw tightened immediately. Familiar words. Familiar pattern. "I reported it internally," she continued. 3 weeks later, I lost my job." Daniel frowned slightly. "That alone does not destroy a career." Claire looked at him then, directly. "No," she said quietly. "But powerful men protecting billions of dollars usually do." The sentence landed heavily between them. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair beneath the dim amber lighting. "You were blacklisted." Claire nodded once. Every interview disappeared after final rounds. Recruiters stopped returning calls. Friends stopped answering messages. She gave a faint shrug afterward, but it looked practiced, like someone who had repeated the motion for years to survive embarrassment. "Eventually, hospitals stopped waiting for my father's bills." Daniel looked away for a moment. Somewhere nearby, a waiter uncorked a bottle of red wine, while soft piano notes floated through the dining room. The normal world continued moving around them, and somehow that made Claire's story feel even sadder. "So you disappeared," Daniel murmured. "No." Claire's voice sharpened slightly for the first time. "I survived." Silence followed. Deep silence. Daniel Whitmore had spent decades believing power belonged to people who won, people who dominated, people who stayed standing after everyone else collapsed. But sitting across from Claire Bennett now, exhausted waitress uniform, tired eyes, fingers wrapped around cheap diner coffee, he suddenly realized survival required a different kind of strength entirely. Claire stood slowly, adjusting. Her apron again, emotional walls returning piece by piece. "You should go home, Mr. Whitmore." Daniel looked up immediately. "Daniel." "Fine," she said softly. "Daniel." Another silence stretched between them. Then Daniel asked the one question he could not stop himself from asking. "Why warn me at all?" Claire paused beside the table beneath the warm chandelier light. Her expression softened slightly then, not toward him specifically, but toward something inside herself. "Because," she answered quietly, "I know what it feels like when nobody tells the truth before everything falls apart." The next morning, Whitmore Capital looked less like a financial empire and more like a building trying not to collapse under its own fear. Phones rang nonstop across trading floors. Television screens flashed red banners every few minutes. Analysts rushed between glass offices carrying reports nobody trusted anymore. And at the center of it all stood Daniel Whitmore, silent, watching his own company unravel piece by piece. "We have confirmation," Richard Lawson said quietly inside the executive boardroom. His face looked pale beneath the harsh white ceiling lights. Several offshore holdings tied to Harbor Point were intentionally concealed through secondary reporting structures. Daniel did not react immediately. He simply stared at the stack of documents spread across the conference table while early morning sunlight struggled through storm clouds beyond the windows. "How many people knew?" he asked. Richard swallowed carefully. "At least 6 executives." Daniel nodded once. "Slow. Controlled. Dangerous. And how many believed I would never notice?" Nobody answered. Because everybody already knew the truth. Too many years of profit had slowly poisoned the company from the inside. Men stopped reporting risks. Stopped challenging assumptions. Stopped telling the truth. Because keeping Daniel Whitmore happy had become more important than protecting the company itself. Daniel walked toward the windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Wet streets reflected pale morning light, while helicopters drifted between skyscrapers carrying news crews chasing the market collapse below. She saw it immediately. He murmured almost to himself. Richard frowned slightly. "Claire Bennett." Daniel nodded once. "One conversation." His jaw tightened subtly. "One conversation, and she found what my entire executive team missed for months." Behind him, nobody dared speak. Because deep down, they all understood the humiliation of it too. Meanwhile, 20 blocks away, Claire Bennett sat quietly beside her father's bed inside St. Mary's Medical Center. Soft afternoon light spilled gently through hospital blinds while machines hummed quietly nearby. Her father slept peacefully for the first time in days, silver hair resting against the white pillow as rain tapped softly against the window outside. Claire adjusted the blanket over his shoulders carefully. Then she opened the hospital billing envelope sitting untouched beside her coffee cup. Final notice. Her expression did not change, but her fingers tightened slightly against the paper. "Miss Bennett." A nurse approached softly near the doorway. "There is someone asking for you downstairs." Claire already knew. Again, when she stepped into the hospital lobby 15 minutes later, Daniel Whitmore stood near the entrance beneath cold marble lighting, dark overcoat folded neatly over one arm. Expensive, controlled, completely out of place beside tired families and exhausted nurses carrying paper coffee cups through the lobby. Claire stopped several feet away. "You really do not like giving up," she said quietly. Daniel looked at her for a moment before answering. "I spent 30 years believing intelligence was easy to recognize." Claire crossed her arms lightly. "And now?" Daniel glanced around the hospital lobby. The old man sleeping in a wheelchair near the elevators. The exhausted mother rocking a crying toddler softly near the reception desk. Real life. Ordinary life. The kind money rarely notices. Then he looked back at Claire. "Now I think the smartest person I know has been serving me coffee for 2 days." Claire looked away immediately, uncomfortable with the sincerity in his voice. Daniel noticed that too. He reached slowly into his coat pocket and placed a folded envelope onto the nearby table between them. "What is that?" Claire asked. "Your father's hospital balance." Claire's eyes hardened instantly. "No." Daniel nodded once as though expecting the answer. "It is not charity." "Then what is it?" Daniel held her gaze steadily beneath the cold hospital lights. "The truth," he said quietly. "For the first time in a very long time, somebody earned my respect before asking for anything in return." Claire stared at the envelope on the hospital table for a very long time without touching it. Around them, the lobby moved quietly through another gray Chicago afternoon, elevator bells chiming softly, nurses walking quickly between hallways, rainwater dripping from umbrellas near the entrance. Real life continuing exactly as it always had. Daniel Whitmore stood across from her in silence, hands folded calmly in front of him. No arrogance left now. No performance. Just a man finally learning the difference between power and worth. "I cannot accept this," Claire said at last, her voice low but steady. Daniel nodded once. "I know." Claire looked up at him carefully. "Then why bring it?" Daniel glanced toward the large hospital windows where cold daylight reflected against polished marble floors. "Because 10 years ago," he answered quietly, "someone should have helped you before you disappeared." Claire's expression shifted slightly at that. Tiny movement. barely visible. But enough. Daniel noticed. He always noticed now. The difference was, he finally understood what mattered. Claire slowly pushed the envelope back toward him across the table. Paying bills will not change what happened. No, Daniel admitted. But maybe listening can. Silence settled gently between them again. Softer this time. Less guarded. Somewhere nearby, a little boy laughed as his mother adjusted his baseball cap crookedly near the elevators. Claire watched them for a moment before speaking. You know what the worst part was? She asked quietly. Daniel did not interrupt. It was not losing the career. Her tired blue eyes drifted toward the rain outside. It was realizing how quickly intelligent people become invisible once they stop being useful to powerful ones. Daniel lowered his gaze briefly. Because there was no defense against the truth. He had spent most of his life surrounded by polished resumes, expensive watches, and confident voices in boardrooms. Yet the one person honest enough to warn him before disaster arrived had been carrying coffee cups beneath restaurant chandeliers. The irony stayed heavy in his chest. A week later, financial news across the country exploded with reports about internal corruption investigations tied to Whitmore Capital. Executives resigned quietly. Offshore accounts were exposed. Reporters crowded sidewalks outside corporate buildings searching for answers. But inside Whitmore Prime Steakhouse on a calm Friday evening, none of that seemed to matter much anymore. Warm golden light reflected against polished glasses while soft piano music drifted through the dining room again. Claire moved between tables carrying fresh coffee with the same calm grace she always had. No dramatic transformation. No sudden luxury. Just dignity. Quiet and steady. Near the back lounge, Daniel Whitmore sat alone at a corner table without an entourage for the third Friday in a row. Not because he needed financial advice anymore, but because somewhere between market crashes and painful truths, he had learned something far more valuable. Respect is not earned through money. Sometimes, it arrives quietly wearing a waitress uniform and exhausted eyes. Claire approached his table with the coffee pot and raised an eyebrow slightly. You know there are easier ways to drink coffee in this city. Daniel smiled faintly for the first time in days. A real smile this time. Probably, he admitted. But none of them remind me to pay attention. Claire shook her head softly while pouring the coffee. Then, just before walking away, she allowed herself the smallest smile too. Quiet. Genuine. Human. And maybe that was the real lesson after all. The strongest people are often the ones the world overlooks first. If this story moved you even a little, tell us in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who only saw your job title instead of your true value? And what do you think matters more in life? Success, or the courage to tell the truth when nobody wants to hear it?